you know, I'm a professor now, I have tenure, and people ask me how I got to this place and doing this work, and I always tell them that I never could have conceived of this ever in my wildest dreams of being my life and what I do with my life. And that, you know, I'm a first generation college student. I don't know if there are any others in the room, but it was Dr. C and Professor Saladino who told me, like, you could do that. You could go get a PhD. They might even pay you to do it. They might give you health insurance, which I did not have and really needed. So it's such an honor to be back and to get to show you what I did. And I did. I have a just silly. Yeah. Okay. So this was when I was a student here. I forget what year, but I was involved in. At the time, it was called Vox, Voices for Planned Parenthood, and I think this was on an HIV testing day. And we have this for an art school. I don't know how we ended up with such a terrible mascot outfit, but this was supposed to be a condom. And yeah, that's me. I went here. Some levity, because I'm about to talk about some things that are pretty rough, so get ready, I suppose. So in 2011, a 25-year-old white woman named Heather Capps gave birth to a healthy baby boy via cesarean section, this like fat, gorgeous baby. Her newborn baby tested positive for opioids. Heather had opioid use disorder, which developed after she'd been prescribed the drug to treat her chronic back pain, such a typical story. Heather lived in Alabama in a small town in the northeast part of the state. And she'd heard about this local policy ordering the prosecution of women who use drugs during pregnancy on the basis that their drug use constituted a form of child abuse. What started as a local policy based on a radical interpretation of a new law spread across the state, resulting in the arrests of many hundreds of people. The law in question had created this new crime, chemical endangerment of a minor, which is meant to protect children from illicit meth labs. They were thinking of like toddlers in trailer park meth labs. This crime, this law, makes it illegal to have children in an environment, keyword, where drugs, drug precursors, drug paraphernalia, drug production take place. And you can see the words of the law here. It says nothing about pregnancy, fertilized eggs, embryos, or fetuses. During the passage of this law, they tried to write pregnancy in and failed to do so. They explicitly stated this law did not apply to fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. But despite this, a growing number of prosecutors around the state started using this law to punish pregnant and postpartum folks who tested positive for drugs. They argued that the uterus was an environment and that fetuses are legal children. After hundreds of arrests, the Alabama Supreme Court heard a challenge. In Ex parte Ankrum from 2013, the court found that chemical endangerment could be applied to policing pregnancies. And they went further than any prosecutor in the state had. They went so far as to say that this law applied not only to fetuses, but to fertilized eggs and embryos, right? From the earliest moments of a pregnancy, this law applies. So let's get back to Heather. She'd heard about this punitive policy. It was not anything kind of official legally yet. But she'd also heard that the symptoms, the withdrawal symptoms from quitting oxycodone, going cold turkey, could be really dangerous for her. She was worried that she would miscarry this pregnancy. And she didn't want to have an abortion. She wanted to give birth and raise this baby. She really wanted help. She was unemployed. She relied on Medicaid and about $200 a month in food stamps to support her family. She was referred to an inpatient drug treatment facility in Birmingham, which is about an hour and a half away from her. She doesn't have a car. She doesn't have anyone to watch after her children. Right? She's a single mom. Inpatient drug treatment is not a workable option for her. So she was trapped, essentially. And seeing no other solutions, she decided to try to manage her own substance use disorder and taper down her use of the drug as much as she could to try to protect her pregnancy. She gave birth, C-section, and 2 days after she gave birth, still in the hospital, still recovering from the C-section, she was arrested. She spent the next 3 months in jail, separated from her newborn and her 2 other children, unable to post $500,000 bond. Over a year after her arrest, Heather finally pled guilty to a charge of chemical endangerment of a minor because she gave birth to a healthy child. This was a Class C felony. In Alabama, crimes designated as Class C felonies are punishable by 1 to 10 years in prison. She was given a 3-year suspended sentence, so if she completed a rehab program, she wouldn't have to serve the 3 years in prison. Heather was ordered to stay in a halfway house while she was in court-ordered rehab. And during that time, she was allowed to see her children only once a week. So for Heather to finally access the drug treatment she wanted and sought out, she was forced to self-manage substance use disorder through a pregnancy. She was forcibly separated from her newborn and 2 young children. She was arrested, forced to spend her first 3 months postpartum in jail, including in suicide watch, by the way. She'd had a prior overdose on her medical record, and very typically jails will interpret that as a suicide attempt, whether or not it was intentional. Suicide watch in a jail is essentially like solitary confinement, except you're naked, because you can hurt yourself with your clothes. So imagine, she's just had a C-section. Her milk comes in, and it's leaking down her abdomen onto her cesarean site. She's bleeding vaginally, she has no underpants even, right? And she's left there. She spends 3 months there. She does a guilty plea for felony child abuse, which is going to limit her life, right, going into the future. And then she's assigned to this halfway house with supposed to complete drug treatment with the stress of a possible 3-year prison sentence hanging over her. All of this to get drug treatment she wanted and asked for. And this is just one of the 1,116 arrest cases included in my study. Each case is so much more than a number. These cases represent real people with histories and families and very often complicated lives. And I only have the tiniest glimpse into their lives, right? I get to view their life through their court documents and sometimes a few media articles maybe. It's evident that many of the people arrested for crimes against their pregnancies experienced trauma before their pregnancies, during their pregnancies, and after, in birth and incarceration. They have one thing in common. They were arrested for crimes against their own pregnancies from 1973 to 2022. Yes. The criminal prosecution of pregnant people for crimes against the fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses they carry relies on a legal understanding that pregnant people are legally distinct from and enjoy fewer rights than other similarly situated non-pregnant people. Pregnant people occupy a different, lower space in the United States system of law. And I call this pregnancy exceptionalism, where pregnancy ipso facto, or like in and of itself, is the thing that reduces a person's legal status relative to other persons. So for example, typically because of medical privacy laws, including HIPAA, a positive drug test at a doctor's office cannot be legally shared with law enforcement. But pregnant and postpartum people have been arrested after their healthcare providers gave this information over, often just on the basis of a single positive drug test. Generally, people who survive attempts to end their lives are not criminally prosecuted because it is not a crime. But pregnant and postpartum people have been charged with felonies when they survive but lose their pregnancies. Legally competent adults are, generally speaking, allowed to reject a course of medical treatment. That's some very old case law. This is like fundamental rights stuff. But pregnant people, not so much. You can literally be cut open against your will if you're pregnant and someone decides they need to do it to you. You do not get to reject a course of medical treatment. And you can be criminally charged if you resist. Pregnant people are being held criminally accountable for actions and behaviors that would otherwise be legal or at the very least non-prosecutable, like drinking a beer or testing positive for marijuana, or in some cases even taking your legal prescription medication. Pregnant folks have also been charged with crimes more severe than what their actual conduct would typically warrant. So for example, a pregnant person who's found to be in possession of methamphetamine might be charged with, instead of just possession, something like unlawful neglect of a child, or delivery of drugs to a minor through the umbilical cord, instead of just drug possession. The pregnancy police don't exist as a discrete agency or department yet, and I hope they never do. Who knows? They don't currently carry special pregnancy police badges or wear special uniforms, so I often think about what those might look like. But they're all around us. Sometimes they wear scrubs and white coats. You can find them at the hospital or the CPS office. Sometimes they're deputized to police pregnancy by law, and other times they're just making stuff up as they go. They are our neighbors, our partners, and our friends. They are nurses, doctors, and social workers. Sometimes we're the pregnancy police. If you see someone who's pregnant doing something that you might not approve of, and you have this little itch in the back of your head that's like, why are you lifting something heavy? Oh, who runs when they're that pregnant? Maybe think about what that voice is coming from. In general, the pregnancy police are those who are involved in surveilling, reporting, prosecuting, and incarcerating pregnant people for pregnancy-related offenses. And just to give you an idea of some of the numbers here, I found healthcare providers at over 100 healthcare facilities, and I only looked at 3 states. I looked at South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. We can talk about why later if you want. Healthcare providers are responsible for initiating 75% of these cases. If you are going to be arrested for a pregnancy crime, odds are it is a doctor or nurse who turns you in. But like I said, it's also probation officers, social workers, sometimes friends, partners, family, neighbors. Throughout the United States, pregnant and postpartum people have, for decades, faced charges for committing crimes against the fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses they carry. These arrests have occurred in the absence of any declarative criminal law, and even in the presence of statutes that say you can't prosecute a pregnant person for a crime against their own pregnancy. So this is only 3 states, South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee, have explicitly criminalized pregnant people's actions with regard to their pregnancies. Oklahoma's in there too now. But you should remember, and I know I'm in the South, so I don't feel quite as defensive about this as I do when I give this talk in California. Yes, these are 3 southern states. They do this everywhere. Cases have been documented in every state but Delaware and Vermont. And yes, states like California and New York have been very active in this. So I know that we like to feel kind of, there's a little bit of that West Coast arrogance, you know. They do bad stuff too. So I'm concerned because the widespread nature of these arrests, right, they've happened in virtually every state, suggests that there are webs of formal or informal pregnancy police in place throughout the country, and these are not difficult networks to replicate. And so for today, I just want to talk about some of my research findings, and I want to share some of the lessons that they can offer us. We're trying to think about what are we going to do, or what might be coming next. I'm hoping that this can give us some idea. So what kind of things can you get arrested for? So many things. These are just some of the things. Self-managed abortion, which I know is something a lot of us are thinking about. Not taking good enough care of themselves during pregnancy. That is a quote from a criminal complaint. So just imagine, when I think of how much pizza I've eaten in the last month, like, imagine, like, taking good care of yourself. How do you do that? Abuse of a corpse. If you have a miscarriage or stillbirth or self-managed abortion at home, what do you do with the products of conception? It's generally not something that there are laws about, but they'll go ahead and prosecute you for it anyway. Folks who survive suicide but miscarry, folks who reject medical advice, people who are found to not be at fault in car accidents, who lost pregnancies because they were in car accidents. And I know that seems like, how is that possible? I know. Another case, failing to protect a fetus from third-party harm. I'll tell you about that later. One case, someone was running from the police. She had, I think, an outstanding warrant, and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Some of the cops went to pull her over. She sped away. High-speed chase ensued. She's gonna get in trouble for that. She pulls over, she gets out of her car, she starts running on foot. And she's eventually apprehended. She's very pregnant. But they don't just charge her because she was running from the police. They add reckless endangerment of a minor because she happened to be doing all of that while she was pregnant. But the vast majority of the cases that I looked at involved a positive drug test, often only one. Folks who were using drugs during their pregnancy, and maybe they're caught while they're still pregnant or when they're in labor. The charges were all over the place. This is one of the things that's made it so hard to study this. Because you can't just do a Freedom of Information Act request for the pregnancy ones, right? It's like so many different charges. Inflicting great bodily injury to a child, unlawful performance of abortion, homicide. It doesn't get much more serious than that, right? I mentioned distribution of drugs to a minor. There are two ways you can do it. One is if you're worried about Roe's viability standards, and the other is if you don't care. So if you're worried about viability, can we say you were endangering a child when it was still inside you? I don't know. And so they'll say, in the moments after you gave birth, while the umbilical cord was still intact, blood was pumping. Tainted blood was pumping. So like in that 30 seconds, maybe, they cut those cords pretty quick. That's when the crime took place. Involuntary manslaughter is another one. South Carolina mostly used unlawful neglect of a minor. Alabama mostly used chemical endangerment of a minor. Tennessee mostly used fetal assault, which was a 2-year law. It was a criminal law with a built-in expiration date, which is pretty bizarre for a criminal law. And then reckless endangerment is another. Sources of information. How are you going to get caught? Who's going to catch you? This is something that I know has been a great deal of concern after Roe was overturned. I remember getting a lot of calls from reporters asking, you know, are we supposed to delete our period tracker apps now? Maybe. Any kind of electronic data that you have can be used as evidence against you, but generally speaking, the thing you need to be most concerned about is other people tattling on you. We have not seen a single case initiate from something other than a word-of-mouth report. And these are, generally speaking, healthcare provider reports, social worker reports, medical records. Anything on your medical record can become part of the evidence used against you, and it becomes public information, by the way. People's medical record. Like, I know what STDs people have, and that seems like something that shouldn't be possible through a FOIA. But in other cases, neighbors, family members, friends, they might not even realize what could happen after they tell, right? I'm trying to help. There was one case where they used a Facebook post. So yeah, in at least one case, possibly more, law enforcement used social media to gather information about a defendant. After she gave birth, one woman's newborn was drug tested using the meconium, the first bowel movement. And law enforcement was notified of this positive drug test, and they began an investigation. They searched her publicly available Facebook profile and found a pregnancy announcement post. And they used this information to argue that she was aware of her pregnancy when she used drugs. This is the only documented case in the study where social media was used as supporting criminal evidence. Electronic information like search histories, text messages, yes, potentially your period tracker apps, they can be used in these cases as evidence. Any kind of electronic evidence you can think of that we use in maybe a murder case can be used here. However, like I said, the initial point of contact is always a person making a report. They're not doing like, let's sweep everyone who had a regular period and investigate them, right? We're not quite there yet. In another case, an Alabama Crisis Pregnancy Center, or CPC, gave information over to law enforcement. This is the first documented case of this. CPCs are anti-abortion centers that frequently pose as actual healthcare providers to lure, gather information on, and provide misinformation to prospective abortion patients, advertising free ultrasounds to bring people through the doors. In this case, a woman was arrested after her newborn tested positive for cocaine. In 2016, she had sought a free ultrasound at the Save a Life Center, a chain of CPCs in Alabama. And I'm still digging into this. I found like a decades-old newspaper article. It seems like the guy who owns this chain of CPCs has connection with law enforcement. I think that's how they found out about this. So after she was arrested, the center gave law enforcement information about the date of her last menstrual period, the regularity of her cycle, and her contraceptive practices. And like in the aforementioned case, they used this information to argue that she was aware of her pregnancy at the time that she had used the drugs. So there's an intent argument here. This is the first documented case, but I'm fairly confident it is not the only one. So some lessons here. and I know this one's terrible, healthcare providers are not necessarily safe, y'all. You should be able to tell your healthcare provider everything, right? You should be able to have like judgment-free conversations about relevant medical information. But in these cases, they're essentially acting like an arm of law enforcement. They're collecting evidence. And maybe also providing health care. Who knows which one is happening when, right? Is this a healthcare drug test or a evidence drug test? Remember that social media can be used, but it's generally not the first point of contact. And I don't know if there are any healthcare providers in the room, or maybe medical students. Hey. If you don't want to participate in policing your patients, think about what you write down on charts. Because anything you write down can be used. And also think about maybe which tests you decide to run. Does that person actually need to be drug tested? Maybe you could just ask them and not write down their answer. Right? These are strategies. I interviewed prosecutors for this project. I was still a graduate student when I did this, so I had no real Googleable profile, and they were very happy to talk to me. They referred to me as the girl from the college. She's like, yeah, it's harmless, tell her everything. I went back, I tried to do more interviews a couple of years ago, right after Dobbs, and so it was so politically hot, and I was pretty Googleable at that point, and nobody wanted to talk to me. But they said all kinds of things when I was still a graduate student. And these were the prosecutors who were among the first in their states to start making these arrests. One of the things I saw when I started documenting and coding these cases is that many of them happen before the actual official legal change that says, yeah, you can prosecute these folks. And so in this way, these are like policy innovators, right? That they get this idea, and it eventually spread around the state, and we have legal precedent, right, or the legislature would pass a law. They were very cognizant of the fact that they were operating under shaky legal foundations. They said that they wanted an official law, or they wanted a court ruling to kind of explain exactly what they could get away with, right? Are we doing pre-viability or post-viability? Are we doing all of the drugs or only some of the drugs? They just weren't quite sure. But in general, they were approached by healthcare providers or social workers who said, hey, we're seeing a lot of patients who are pregnant and they're using drugs. And we're telling them to not use drugs, but for some reason, just telling them isn't making them not use drugs. So maybe you can give us some teeth. We can threaten them. Get drug treatment, or you're going to be charged with a crime. Get drug treatment, or you're going to prison. And these prosecutors, these few who kind of got the ball rolling, were very happy to do that. And they very much had blinders up, right? I don't care how people develop substance use disorder, what kind of trauma. I don't know if there is actually treatment available. I don't know what happens to them after. I am here with my velvet hammer, is what they called it, and I am just prosecuting as best as I can. And sorry, there should be a line and another bullet point there. With the exception of one prosecutor, they all had this very benevolent kind of paternalistic attitude. I don't want to punish anyone. I'm just here to help them because they don't know what they need. They don't know what's best for them. I do, right? But some of them, this one guy in northern Alabama in particular, he had a picture of the Pope on the wall in his office, and he made it very clear that this is part of his political agenda, promoting fetal personhood in the law. And that for him, it's obvious, of course, when we say fetus, we mean legal person. There are also some echoes of eugenic thinking. I have a whole chapter about this in the book. And this is about the idea that these drug-exposed infants will be inherently damaged, which is not true. We can talk about the medicine of that if you would like. But that these damaged babies are going to cost us so much money. They're going to be inherently criminal, psychos, right? I mean, they almost, like it's a horde of zombies, right? That these bad moms are kind of unleashing upon America. The language that they use is really striking. They went hard. talking about this as really like catastrophic. One prosecutor stopped pursuing prosecutions, which I thought was pretty interesting. This guy was fascinating. He was a real tough on crime Republican guy, and he had gotten a lot of notoriety. He prosecuted a very high-profile case of a woman in South Carolina who murdered her 2 children. And so he had some pretty serious tough on crime credibility. And he said that's why he was able to stop prosecuting these cases. Because people wouldn't think, oh, he's just some tree-hugging feminist man. Right? Like, this is the tough on crime guy. In his circuit, there is a really incredible drug treatment facility that will actually admit pregnant folks. It's not typical. They'll let you bring your children. It's also not typical. These are the kinds of things that people need if drug treatment's really going to work for them. And they gave him a talking to, and he actually listened to them. He, like, willing to learn a new thing. They sort of explained to him how, like, medically this makes no sense. You're not offering anyone any resources, so how are they supposed to just stop using drugs, right? You can't maternal love your way out of substance use disorder. So he stopped these prosecutions. It's a possibility there. But yeah, in general, people were pretty harsh. So some of the things prosecutors compared drug use during pregnancy to, just the violent imagination of some of these things. It's like, what do you guys spend your time thinking about, okay? It's abuse of a child. It is taking a pistol and shooting the baby right through the mother's stomach, or taking a knife and sticking it in there. Drunk driving, which of course turns the pregnant person into a car. Bombing a building with children inside, you have now become a building. Lacing baby formula with drugs, injecting drugs into a child, driving without a seatbelt, you're a car again. And kidnapping for 9 months at a time. It's like, I don't know where else they're supposed to be. Kidnapped from what? They're pretty shocking, but you can just see, I mean, if this is what drug use during pregnancy is, and they're moralizing it in this way, of course the solution would be punishment, right? If someone bombed a building full of children, you might want to punish them, right? Maybe. So some lessons there. The law, as written, can and will be undermined by prosecutors if they think they can get away with it. And these ones did. Some prosecutors may be open to change, so we can try, but some of them probably won't be. In which case, we should remember that in a lot of places, prosecutors are elected positions. And prosecutors can be influenced or voted out. And so I know there's an election coming up when we're all talking about the president. Maybe look into who the prosecutor is where you are. Maybe find out if they're doing some shenanigans, and vote accordingly. Pregnancy outcomes. People are generally very interested in how these cases end. I think a lot of us might expect, oh, drugs during pregnancy, probably a lot of stillbirths, miscarriages, damaged babies. No, not particularly. Most cases involved the birth of a healthy baby. 89 cases I coded as complicated births. These were generally prematurity or withdrawal symptoms or low birth weight. Withdrawal symptoms, we do not have an unbiased way of diagnosing withdrawals, and even some of the assessment tools that we have come up with to try to reduce bias in determining, like, is that just a weird kind of trembly baby? Because newborns are kind of weird and trembly, right? Or is this a baby that's having withdrawals? We tend to look at, for example, a black trembling baby. We are more likely to diagnose that baby with withdrawals than a white trembling baby, right? So even then, when they're saying, oh, withdrawals, I have some questions. How much of that was just we knew the mom used drugs, right? Miscarriage or stillbirth were present in 77 cases. 11 cases involved multiples, which is something to think about. What a roll of the dice. If you have twins, you're committing crime against 2 children. If you have triplets, you are committing crime against 3 children. And these pregnancies are already higher risk. So if anything bad happens, the penalties are going to be much higher. And you could, if you're sentenced, right, serve them consecutively or concurrently, whatever they want, right? 208 cases, or about 19% of cases, involved people who were still pregnant at the time of their arrest. They often gave birth in custody, shackled in the hospital, or unattended in a jail cell. Notably, some of the defendants who were pregnant at the time of their arrest could have legally procured an abortion, right? These arrests took place before Dobbs. You could still have an abortion in Alabama when we're also prosecuting people for potentially endangering fetuses, right? A total of 17 defendants were in their first trimester at the time of their arrest. 4 were as early as 6 weeks gestation or 2 weeks after a missed period. So really the earliest moments when we're like detecting pregnancies even. And we have seen post-Dobbs, those very early pregnancy arrests we are seeing more of. That speaks to the prosecutors who were worried about like, do we have to wait until after viability? Not anymore. So these pictures are pretty shocking to look at, and I'm going to move away from them quickly, but this is somebody who is in labor and pushing and is shackled. Okay, you can see that her wrists are together. We don't know what her ankles look like, but they are probably, at least one of them is chained to the bed. Several people gave birth while shackled or handcuffed to the hospital bed. The use of shackles on pregnant or postpartum people is especially problematic. We can talk about use of shackling in general. I think we should maybe talk about that. But it's especially problematic when we do this to pregnant folks. It's supposed to prevent incarcerated people from fleeing. We have no documented cases of very pregnant incarcerated people trying to flee. So I don't know that we would even need to do this. But the potential for injury is so much greater when the person is pregnant. If you fall down, right, you can injure yourself or have a placental eruption. You could lose your pregnancy just because you tripped and didn't have your hands to catch yourself. Also risks delayed progress of labor caused by impaired mobility. Sometimes when you're in labor, and I was a birth doula, so okay. Sometimes when you're in labor, what you want to do is move around. Sometimes you want to walk up and down the hallway. People talk about the ankle cuffs, rubbing their ankles raw, if they're even, able to take steps and those conditions. So you can't move when you're shackled. But also delayed receipt of emergency care is an issue. When corrections officers have to remove shackles to allow for assessment or intervention. And there is a case that I remember where this woman's ankles are shackled together. It is pushing time. Like a human being is coming out of her right now. And the guy with the key was out in the parking lot having a smoke. Right? That is a reality. Shackling during birth has been found to be a violation of the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and a violation of international human rights law. It's described as a form of torture. A lot of states have laws banning shackling, but we still do it a lot, even in the states with bans. The threat of the harm posed by shackling, both for the pregnant person and for the pregnancy, undermines this claim that pregnant people should remain in police custody for the protection of their fetus, right? If they can't be trusted on their own, we should keep them in jail during their pregnancy. Sometimes when we shackle pregnant people, we use a chain or belt around the belly that the ankle cuffs and wrist cuffs are attached to. And I can't really think of a more potent image for the criminalization of pregnancy than a big pregnant belly with a chain around it. People gave birth in a variety of locations, including more than 100 different medical facilities. Non-hospital birth locations included a motel bathroom on the side of the highway and in an abandoned house. Non-hospital births were way overrepresented in this study. So in the US currently, only about 1.64% of births take place outside of a hospital. This is planned home births, birth center. This is like, it just happened really fast and I was just like at the Dollar General and a baby came out. That one of them gave birth at a Dollar General. 7% of the births in my study took place outside of medical settings. It is very possible, and this has been substantiated in other public health studies, that the overrepresentation of out-of-hospital births exists because the knowledge of punitive policies drives people away from care. It disincentivizes a hospital birth. In other words, people avoided the hospital because they were afraid of what would happen if they did go. There is evidence that people with the capacity for pregnancy make conscious efforts to avoid being reported to the authorities and arrested. Indeed, when healthcare providers have essentially become an arm of local law enforcement, patients in need of care might make other plans. It's only logical to do that. Numerous studies have found that punitive test and report policies deter people from medical care for fear that they will be reported, incarcerated, and lose custody of their children. Pregnant folks who use drugs have strategies to avoid detection, including isolating themselves, skipping prenatal appointments, and avoiding treatment, which again, all makes sense. But if you want a really healthy pregnancy, it's not great, right? Especially if you're using drugs and isolating yourself, that's incredibly dangerous. There's also evidence that the stigma associated with pregnancy and drug use has the effect of driving people away from care because they are treated so terribly in medical settings. Disdain, hostility, sometimes even violence. Denial of pain medication is not uncommon. Evasive efforts that I identified included giving false identification or false names at the hospital, fleeing the hospital before they are discharged without their newborns, withholding the fact of their pregnancies from jail staff because they don't want the extra charges to come along. In that case, she miscarried, right? She wasn't getting prenatal care in the jail, and so she miscarried there. Avoiding prenatal care in general, giving birth outside of healthcare settings. One woman went to the hospital only when she was on the brink of sepsis from an infection in her foot. Another woman received prenatal care at the hospital and never returned because she was told she was under investigation. At least 2 women fled the hospital only 3 hours after giving birth. And still another woman attempted to get over state lines when she went into labor. She got in her car and she's going to try to make it out of Tennessee because she wants to give birth somewhere where she won't be charged with a felony. That is the woman who ended up giving birth on the side of the highway. She did not make it out of Tennessee. So some of these lessons, there are probably a lot more. Giving birth to a healthy baby does not mean you are safe from prosecution, right? Most of these cases involve healthy babies. And that you can be jailed and arrested from the very earliest moments of pregnancy. You're not waiting till birth or even viability anymore. It is very well substantiated that criminalizing pregnancy drives people away from care. And so there's this question, and I just love the way that this is stated. How do you know what the goal of a policy is? Look at what the policy does. This policy is not making people healthier or safer. So what is the goal of this policy? Some of these case outcomes, as is common in criminal cases in the US, the defendant pled guilty in almost every case. This is a problem, arguably, in general, maybe something we should figure out. Our criminal justice system could not function if this were not true, and it was true in these cases as well. Generally, people are taking plea bargains. Sentences ranged pretty significantly. Many of them included drug court. This is touted as a less punitive innovation to respond to the reality of substance use disorder, sort of generated when we start understanding maybe the war on drugs is bullshit. Let's try this other thing, drug court. Basically, this is court-mandated drug treatment, and sometimes it is even court-designed drug treatment, meaning that a judge gets to decide what kind of medical treatment you receive. And so if they don't want you to get maintenance medications for your opioid use disorder and your withdrawals, that means you're going to be withdrawing wherever they send you. The Drug Policy Alliance asserts that, among other things, drug courts have made the criminal justice system more punitive towards addiction, not less. Pregnant or postpartum folks were placed in various drug rehab programs on pretrial diversion. It's not clear that all of these people even needed drug treatment. A single positive drug test does not mean you have substance use disorder. All it means is that you tested positive for drugs once. Research has shown that pregnancy can motivate pregnant people with substance use disorder to seek care and treatment, and that the vast majority of women who use drugs try to reduce their consumption during pregnancy. They want to try to have healthy pregnancies. Despite these indications that pregnancy could be a great time, to meet people with support and resources, well, we just don't really have a lot of resources to offer them. Drug treatment is hard to access for anyone, but especially for folks who are pregnant. It's considered an insurance liability. Most facilities will not admit people who are pregnant at all. Quality accredited care is even harder to find. Only 51% of drug treatment facilities in the US are accredited. A lot of them are religiously affiliated. They offer faith-based treatment services, and though religiously affiliated drug treatment programs may be useful or comforting to some, they can maybe provide a sense of comfort or community, not everyone sentenced to receive care in a religious facility believes in the premise or finds the treatment effective. And it is worrisome that a government can send someone to a religiously affiliated treatment center. New Life for Women is one of the treatment centers in my study. It is a Christian rehab program in Alabama. It's described as a long-term, intensive, faith-based, experiential treatment program for women who need help in overcoming their addiction to drugs and alcohol. One woman was kicked out of this program twice for being out of compliance. The first time, she was medically discharged because, quote, her psychological well-being was a concern, end quote. According to a note in the case file, the, quote, client disclosed during an in-house AA meeting that she didn't trust anyone at the facility, including the counselors. Client went even further to disclose that she had thoughts of running away from the facility and going to the truck stops in hopes that someone would kidnap and kill her. At no time did client ever disclose any of these feelings to her counselor, end quote. Her probation officer arranged a meeting with a doctor who put her on some kind of medication. Not all of these Christian facilities will let you take, say, antidepressants. But she was put on some kind of medication and she was sent back to New Life for Women. And she was discharged again. This time because she apparently was not taking the Christian orientation of the treatment plan seriously. The facility noted, quote, one Saturday client was reprimanded for being dressed inappropriately and her response was, everyone else is doing it, in all caps. Sunday, she was caught laughing and giggling with another client during Sunday school. And on Monday night, we had a guest speaker, and the defendant spent the time writing and passing notes with another client, end quote. She was discharged from her court-mandated drug treatment. That means she goes to jail now, because she was giggling. Her issues finding accessible drug treatment options appeared over and over again. In these cases, one woman was ordered to attend treatment as a condition for her release from jail on bond, and she went to an inpatient treatment center, but she started having seizures. Unequipped to care for her, the facility medically released her. And the medical discharge, however necessary, still meant she is out of compliance with her court-ordered rehab, and so she went to prison. Some of the defendants in these cases were sentenced to be sterilized, or to use LARPs like IUDs or arm implants as a condition for bond or plea bargain. I don't have the data on this because child removal data is not public, but it seems very clear that almost everyone who was arrested lost custody of their children, at least temporarily. And I know for sure some of them never got their children back. Folks were also, when I had statements, I had a deposition, for example, where people were interviewed about what their experience was like being treated, being arrested. And really common themes were trauma and grief and mistrust and now plans to never go back to the doctor again. One of the women had a chronic illness, I think lupus, and so she needed to go to the doctor pretty regularly, and she describes now, oh, I just have panic attacks and nightmares all the time, forever now. Because we really needed to protect her pregnancy, you guys. And then in a few cases, there were subsequent pregnancy-related arrests. So you're pregnant, you test positive, you're incarcerated, and then you're let out, and you don't have your baby anymore, and you haven't really gotten any quality care or treatment. And so then you're using drugs, and you get pregnant again, right? And you're arrested again. So how successful is this? I found a lot of repeat cases. Not everyone was sentenced to drug court. Some people got straight jail or prison sentences. The longest sentence was 20 years in prison, this prison, Julia Tutwiler. which is in Alabama. It is like the women's prison, the state prison in Alabama. It is one of the most violent, not women's prisons, period, in the United States. It's gotten in trouble with the DOJ over and over. Sexual abuse there is like pervasive and systematic. They've made a few changes, but it's still severely overcrowded. And like, this is where you go. This is the place where we go when we want to protect your pregnancy. Only 4 cases went to trial, jury trials. In one of those cases, the jury only took 1 hour to find the defendant guilty, and she was sentenced to 18 years in this facility. So we're not talking about nothing sentences, right? Decades in prison. So I want to tell you a few of the non-drug related cases just to give you an idea of what they look like. In 4 cases, charges were brought because of self-managed abortion. In 2003, Gabriela Flores was a 22-year-old mother of 3. She had migrated from Mexico to the US to earn money for her family. She had a 5th grade education and spoke no English, and she found a job picking lettuce in South Carolina for $1.50 an hour. Then she learned she was pregnant. She later explained in a handwritten note to police in Spanish, "I knew that I was not going to be able to support 4 kids, 2 here and 2 in Mexico." She was about 16 weeks pregnant, which is too far along to have a legal abortion in South Carolina. And she could have gone north, North Carolina, Charlotte. She could have had a procedural abortion there, but it cost $700. She makes $1.50 an hour. I don't know if she knows about the funds that exist to help people get care, right? So instead, her sister mailed her some misoprostol tablets from Mexico. Misoprostol, these little hexagons here, they're usually hexagons. It's used to treat gastric ulcers. The name brand is Cytotec, and it can be purchased over the counter in Mexico. Fun fact, you don't need a prescription. If anyone has a trip to Mexico planned in your future, think about it. So misoprostol can be used to terminate a pregnancy. It's one of the 2 medications used in the FDA-approved medication abortion protocol. Mifepristone is the other that you take. But according to the World Health Organization, misoprostol alone can also be used to safely terminate a pregnancy. And so that's what Flores did. She took the tablets, she expelled the fetus on her bed, her housemate helped her bury it in the backyard. And I know talking about what we do with, aborted pregnancies with fetuses, it's not the nicest thing to think about, but you should know that this is pretty common when people miscarry, to flush it down the toilet, to bury it in the yard, some people burn it. It's just a reality. So everything seemed fine, but then her housemate told the neighbor, and the neighbor called the cops. And 6 days after she ended her pregnancy, Gabriela Flores was arrested, and she was charged for self-management of her abortion and failure to notify a coroner about the fetal remains. She was held on $10,000 bond, and the roommate who helped her was charged with obstruction of justice. Those helpers can get caught too, right? Apparently the county solicitor had initially sought homicide charges against Flores, and he wanted to seek the death penalty in her case. But there was just no legal way. There's too much oversight when we talk about death penalty. There was no way he was going to be able to get away with it, at least back then. Flores wrote another note to the prosecutor. She wrote, "Please understand me. My kids need me a lot. They are little. Please forgive me." She spent 4 months in county jail before she was even granted a public defender, which is a violation of her 6th Amendment right to appointed counsel, which should never take that long. She ultimately pled guilty to the illegal abortion, and she was sentenced to serve in another 3 months in jail. I don't know what happened to her after that. I suspect she was probably deported. That's a very real possibility. 3 arrests were made after people survived attempts to end their lives. Suicide isn't a crime, which is why we should stop saying someone attempted suicide. Attempted is a crime word, right? Or committed suicide, right? It's not a crime unless you're pregnant, I guess. So this is a case from 2009 in South Carolina. A 22-year-old white woman was arrested after she survived a jump from her apartment window. She was 8 months pregnant and struggling with bipolar disorder. She and her boyfriend, who she lived with, had a fight earlier that day, and she wasn't stable. She was really struggling with her mental health at this time. She woke up in the night, and her boyfriend wasn't there. He was downstairs smoking a cigarette, but she thought that he had left her. And she's 8 months pregnant, so that's sort of a big deal. She threw herself out of the 5th floor window of her apartment, and she landed on an awning about 4 stories down, which saved her life. She was in the hospital for 6 months. She was very seriously injured, and once her condition stabilized, that is when she was arrested for involuntary manslaughter. She pled guilty to the charges. She was given a sentence of 18 months in prison, suspended upon serving 2 months in prison and 18 months on probation. They did not include information about whether or not she was able to successfully complete her probation. Not everyone always can. It can be really hard to comply. One arrest was made in 2013 when a 21-year-old white woman in Tennessee rejected a course of medical advice. Rejecting medical advice is not considered a crime. It is usually considered a pretty substantial right, but I guess for pregnant people, we're doing something different. She went to the hospital when she went into labor. She was having a lot of pain, and the doctor treating her wanted to transfer her to another hospital. It did not say why in the criminal case documents. If she was, I'm guessing it was preterm labor, and that they probably wanted to send her somewhere with an NICU. And when she did not consent to being transferred, it seems that they just decided they were not going to treat her at all. So, she left the hospital, and she ended up giving birth in the parking lot. And her newborn died soon after, which could have happened anyway, right? We don't know, they don't include that information here. She was charged with second-degree murder. She was arrested and held on $50,000 bond. The charges were eventually reduced from second-degree murder to aggravated child abuse and neglect. Here, another case. This case got a lot of international outrage. You may be familiar with it. In 2019, a 28-year-old black woman named Marche Jones was about 5 months pregnant when she got into a fight with Ebony Jemison, who was dating the father of Marche's baby. Ebony had a gun and used it to shoot Marche in the abdomen, causing a stillbirth. Marche was interrogated by law enforcement for about 20 minutes while she was still being stabilized in the ER, which is also not uncommon in these cases at all. Several months later, who do you think was arrested? Not the person who shot the gun. Marche was arrested. She was charged with and indicted for manslaughter for her own pregnancy loss. Ebony was 23 at the time. She was not charged, as prosecutors argued that she'd acted in self-defense. And about a month after her arrest, there was so much public outcry. I don't know how the news found out about this case, but it was everywhere, international news. They dropped the charges. But I think if the press hadn't gotten hold of this story, I don't think for a second they would have dropped those charges. Right? Marche's life would be looking very, very different than it is now. But right, her face was posted up everywhere, right, as a woman who endangered her pregnancy. So some lessons just from those stories. You can be prosecuted whether or not you intend to terminate a pregnancy, and drug use is not the only thing. These non-criminal actions become crimes in the context of pregnancy. And this is something that terrifies me a lot. You can be prosecuted for other people's actions if you are blamed for causing those actions or failing to protect yourself from those actions. I'm rage writing a op-ed right now about, did you see this case recently? A football player in Georgia assaulted a pregnant woman and was charged with assaulting the fetus. They don't even, and like, I'm not a carceral feminist, and so like, I don't know what we're charging people, whatever we're trying to do here, but like, they didn't even recognize that he did harm to a person. They only recognized that he endangered a fetus. We know that the time in your life when you are most likely to be murdered as a woman is when you are pregnant. We know that pregnancy is a leading cause of death, or that murder is a leading cause of death of pregnant people. It's a reality, right? IPV tends to get worse if it exists in a relationship once someone in the couple is pregnant. And so, right, this case wasn't a couple, it was this weird love triangle thing, but I'm just imagining if the person you live with is beating you up, and they tell you, if you go to the cops, it's not, you don't even have to worry about they're not going to believe you. If you go to the cops, they are going to believe you, and it's still going to be your fault because you didn't get out of there and you endangered this child, right? And we do this to moms with born children all the time. But imagine now if we can apply this to pregnancy as well. So all of that happened before Dobbs, right? It was never a golden era of reproductive rights, ever. We know criminalization of pregnancy has been happening. The earliest case in my study was 1986. And this is something that many abortion rights advocates ignored because it was drug stuff and it wasn't white women at first. This isn't really a feminist issue, this is a race issue. Like, excuse me? We also know that prosecution for abortion has been happening. Legal abortion has been accessible, right? I mean, just after Roe v. Wade, we had cases of people dying from botched abortions because they could not access legal care. But Dobbs makes all of this worse. So we now have more explicit criminalization of abortion providers, people who help folks access abortion, and the patients. They're all vulnerable to criminal charges. And those perceived legal limits from Roe, those viability limits, are gone now. We don't have to worry about that. Since Dobbs, we have seen in the legislature, I track introduced legislation. The legislation that fails but gets introduced is so interesting. And sometimes it fails 5 years in a row and then it's passed, right? So folks are interested in pursuing death penalty for abortion, criminalizing the people who prescribe, who ship, who order, and even the employees at credit card companies who run electronic transactions for the purchase of abortion pills. And of course the people who actually take the pills, right? We're considering criminalizing all of them. We have now legislation to prevent prosecutorial discretion. There were a few prosecutors after Dobbs who said, don't worry, in my state, as long as I'm in charge, I'm not going to be prosecuting abortion cases. And the states replied pretty quickly to say, well, if you don't, then you're going to get in trouble. You're going to be kicked out of office or you will be held criminally culpable. As abortion becomes less accessible, people who want to try to maintain their reproductive autonomy are forced to put themselves not necessarily in a medically challenging position, because abortion pills are very safe, but in a legally precarious position. And then this is a bee in my bonnet. Precedents that were set using some of these drug cases are being used to do other things now. So Alabama in 2013, remember, said that fertilized eggs are children. And they said that in the context of drug cases, moms who use drugs when they're pregnant. Do you remember a few months ago when Alabama said that frozen embryos are also children? I mean, like, why wouldn't they be? They already said fertilized eggs were, right? But there was a lot of outrage when they said it this time, because we weren't talking about impoverished drug users. We were talking about people who can afford IVF. And the people who tend to be able to access IVF are not low-income people of color, right? These are, like, in terms of population, we've got some more power and some more legitimacy going on there. Would have been cool if we cared back then. I don't know, I think that if this as an issue had been on more people's radar, I don't know that we would be where we are right now. And so what lessons? Let's talk about this guy first. You know this guy? Old Anthony. This is Anthony Comstock. Look at the mutton chops. Okay, so this was a guy, one of my students said it best on a test. And I said, who is Anthony Comstock? And they said, he was that guy that was afraid of sex. Yeah, I mean, we could talk a lot about this guy. Apparently he had his own self-abuse problem. That's an old-timey euphemism for masturbation. And he felt really guilty about that. And actually, there were a bunch of people around at this time that thought that masturbation could kill you. Like, really, really? Not just like you're going to hell, but that like doing that, you will die. Like you're robbing yourself of your vitality, buddy, right? And they sort of thought that any kind of sexual pleasure or engaging really in anything in this like earthly realm was corrupting and that was gonna ruin America. This was a time when we were freaking out about immigration, the falling white birth rate, emancipated enslaved people. This is around the time when we banned abortion for the first time, because we need more white babies being born, right? And Anthony was really into that. So he wrote this law that was adopted in 1873, known as the Comstock Act, and states followed suit with their own state versions of this law. This is a federal ban on shipping obscene material through the mail, USPS or private mail carriers. And at the time, what counted as obscene was porn, like vintage porn, and erotica, sex toys, which did exist back then, condoms, contraceptives, abortifacients, right? People would take little special teas and things. You could see them advertised in magazines even. But they would also ban medical texts. I don't know if they had like naked drawings in them or something, or they explained how to do abortions. Instruments used to do procedural abortion were also deemed to be obscene. And the thing that's really, it's just, it's terrible. It's such a bummer. I can't really overstate what a nightmare it is that this law was never overturned, y'all. This law is still in the books. We stopped enforcing it in the 30s, but we never overturned it, and the next president could totally decide to enforce the Comstock Act again. And so what will they decide is obscene? Think about what they might decide is obscene. Easily peasily, birth control. Obscene. Okay? So we're not in a great place legally. From these lessons, marginalized people are more vulnerable. These are people of color. I write a lot about poor white trash, critical whiteness stuff, racialized white folks, sort of a group of sub-white, low-income white people. They're the most vulnerable, but nobody is safe, ultimately. They are coming for everyone. And we've seen just over these last few decades of this, that the population that is targeted has expanded and expanded and expanded. We also need to drop the respectability politics thing. I get that people who were working on abortion rights thought, we're already talking about abortion. Are you sure you want to start talking about drugs too? Isn't that a little too icky? That's a losing game. Because legally, these issues are very much tied together. And I would argue that these social movements need to be tied together as well. Also, just remember that the law only sort of matters. I gave this talk to a bunch of law students yesterday, by the way, which was fun. Right? The law only matters if we all pretend it's real. Because it's made up, right? And so the law only matters if it's being equally enforced for everyone. And here we have the people who are supposed to be enforcing the law undermining it at every turn. And pretty clearly said in interviews, they said to me, the law is whatever you can get away with. Right? Prosecutors saying this. You just gotta remember who you talk to and what you share. Right? Sometimes it is telling a partner or a friend that gets you locked up. Loose lips, sink ships, right? So I know I've told you a bunch of horrible things tonight, and I don't want to leave you without something hopeful. And I actually was not a sci-fi nerd until I met you, Dr. C. And I like to end with this quote from Afrofuturist author Octavia Butler, who died way too young, and this is part of what was supposed to be a series of books. Only 2 of them were published, and this quote was taken from some of her notes for the 3rd book. She wrote that there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. Stepping away from the historical urge to control, punish, and surveil people with the capacity for pregnancy requires us to envision new possibilities, to find a new sun. Just as these oppressive and harmful systems are created and sustained, new ways of being, oriented around human rights and social justice, can be envisioned and sustained. In the words of my friend and mentor, Dr. Monica McLemore, we can make all this different. We have to. Thank you.